Natchez, Mississippi, August 1838. In the suffocating heat of a summer that would be remembered as the cruelest on record, something began happening at Bellwood Plantation that defied every law of the South, every social convention, every understanding of power and bondage that had governed the region since its founding. The master of the estate, a man named Nathaniel Crowder, was seen kneeling before one of his slaves, not in punishment, not in some performance of Christian humility, but in worship. Genuine, terrified, desperate worship. Within 3 months, Bellwood Plantation would become the site of 17 unexplained deaths. Within 6 months, Nathaniel Crowder would vanish entirely, leaving behind only a locked room in the manor house that his widow refused to open for the rest of her life. And within a year, every single slave who had lived on that property would disappear without record or trace, as though they had never existed at all. The local newspaper archives from that period contain no mention of Bellwood Plantation after October 1838. The property deed itself was altered, the name changed, the previous ownership erased from official records. But in the private diaries of neighboring plantation families, in letters carefully preserved by descendants who understood they documented something impossible, the truth remained. A truth so disturbing that it challenged the very foundation of a society built on the absolute dominion of one race over another. What drove a wealthy plantation master to worship the very people he was supposed to own? What power did one slave possess that could reduce his captor to a trembling supplicant? And why were the witnesses to this blasphemy so determined to erase every trace of it from history? Before we continue with the story that would become known in whispered conversations as the Bellwood Abomination, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear represents months of research into suppressed documents, family letters that were never meant to see daylight, and testimony that was deliberately buried because it threatened to expose a reality the plantation aristocracy could never afford to acknowledge. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love connecting with our community of truth seekers across the country. The story begins not at Bellwood, but in Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1837. Nathaniel Crowder was 34 years old, the inheritor of a modest cotton fortune, and a man who by all accounts possessed neither remarkable intelligence nor particular cruelty. He was, in the language of his peers, an adequate master. His slaves were fed sufficiently, punished when necessary but not excessively, and worked at a pace that maximized profit without generating the kind of brutality that occasionally sparked rebellion or flight. He attended church every Sunday, contributed to the appropriate charities, and married a woman from a respectable Virginia family who brought with her both a substantial dowry and impeccable social credentials. In short, Nathaniel Crowder was unremarkable, a man shaped entirely by his time and place, who accepted slavery not because he'd ever questioned its morality, but because he'd never thought to question anything at all. He inherited human property the same way he inherited furniture and land, with the same casual assumption of ownership, with the same fundamental disconnect between the concept of possession and the reality of personhood. But in April of 1837, Nathaniel attended a slave auction in Charleston that would alter the trajectory of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. The auction was held at Ryan's Mart, a location that would later become notorious in abolitionist literature, but which in 1837 was simply another commercial space where human beings were bought and sold with the same procedural efficiency as livestock. Nathaniel had come to the auction looking for field hands. His overseer had reported that productivity was declining, that they needed younger, stronger workers to maintain output during the brutal summer months. What he found instead was a man who would haunt his every waking moment for the rest of his life. The slave was being sold as part of an estate liquidation. His previous owner, a sugar planter from Louisiana named Auguste Fontaine, had died suddenly, leaving behind substantial debts and a plantation that needed to be divided and sold to satisfy creditors. The slave's name, according to the auction documents, was simply Emmanuel. No family name, no history beyond the notation that he'd been born in Louisiana approximately 40 years earlier and had served as a house slave for the entirety of his life. Nathaniel noticed him immediately, not because of any physical beauty or remarkable appearance. Emmanuel was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the deep black skin that suggested pure African ancestry rather than the mixed heritage common among house slaves. His face was marked by tribal scarification, 3 thin lines carved into each cheek, a practice that had been more common decades earlier, but was rarely seen on slaves born in America. His eyes held an intensity that made even the auctioneer uncomfortable, a direct, unflinching gaze that seemed to evaluate every person in the crowd with an intelligence that was supposed to have been beaten out of slaves generations ago. But what struck Nathaniel most powerfully was not Emmanuel's appearance. It was the reaction of the other slaves in the auction yard. As Emmanuel was brought to the block, chained but moving with a strange dignity that seemed at odds with his bondage, every slave within sight stopped what they were doing and watched. Not with curiosity, not with the typical resignation that characterized most auction observations, but with something that looked uncomfortably like reverence or fear. Perhaps both. The bidding started low. Emmanuel was 40 years old, past his prime for fieldwork, and his house servant skills were considered less valuable than the physical labor that drove plantation profits. Most buyers were looking for young males who could work for decades, not a middle-aged slave who might become a burden within a few years. Nathaniel found himself bidding almost without conscious decision, raising his hand mechanically as the price climbed from $300 to $400 to $500. He won Emmanuel for $650, significantly more than he'd intended to spend on a single slave, and certainly more than Emmanuel's apparent value justified. As the paperwork was processed and Emmanuel was transferred to Nathaniel's custody, the slave spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and resonant, with an accent Nathaniel couldn't quite place. It carried traces of French, hints of something older, something that predated European influence entirely. "You don't know what you've purchased," Emmanuel said quietly, his eyes meeting Nathaniel's with an intensity that should have been impossible in a slave addressing his new master. "But you will learn, and once you learn, you will wish you had never raised your hand at this auction." Nathaniel felt a chill run through him despite the Charleston heat. The proper response would have been immediate punishment, a public demonstration that such insolence would not be tolerated. But something in Emmanuel's tone stopped him. It wasn't threat or defiance, it was simply statement, delivered with the flat certainty of someone describing an inevitable future. "Watch your tongue," Nathaniel said, more quietly than he'd intended. "You're mine now. You'll learn to speak appropriately or face consequences." Emmanuel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've belonged to 7 masters," he said. "All of them learned the same lesson. Ownership is an illusion when you don't understand what you own." Before Nathaniel could respond, Emmanuel fell silent and lowered his gaze in the expected posture of submission. But the damage had been done. Those words, delivered with such absolute conviction, would echo in Nathaniel's mind for weeks to come. The journey from Charleston to Bellwood Plantation took 4 days. Nathaniel traveled by carriage with his other recent purchases, 6 field hands who would join the 37 slaves already working his property. Emmanuel rode in the back of a separate wagon, chained and guarded, but seemingly unconcerned by his circumstances. The other slaves kept their distance from him, Nathaniel noticed. When they stopped for the night, the guards made sure Emmanuel was secured well away from the others, not because they feared he would run, but because the other slaves seemed actively afraid of being near him. "What's wrong with that one?" Nathaniel asked his overseer, a hard man named Thomas Garrett, who'd worked at Bellwood for 12 years and had earned a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness in equal measure. Garrett glanced toward Emmanuel, then quickly away. "Don't know, sir, but the others, they won't go near him." Started whispering among themselves the moment they saw him. Some kind of superstition, I expect. Field hands are always carrying on about one thing or another. What are they saying? Garrett hesitated. Won't repeat it, sir, just ignorant talk, Negro foolishness about spirits and such. Tell me anyway. They're saying he's marked, that those scars on his face mean he belongs to something older than slavery, that men who try to own him end up owned themselves. Garrett's voice dropped to near whisper. They're saying his previous masters all died, sir, every one of them, some kind of curse. Nathaniel laughed, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. Superstition, as you said. His previous master died of natural causes. I saw the estate documents. Heart failure. Natural causes can mean many things, sir, and there were 6 masters before that one. You might want to ask about what happened to them. But Nathaniel didn't ask. Part of him didn't want to know. Part of him was already regretting the purchase, wondering why he'd spent so much money on a slave who seemed to radiate unease into everyone around him. Yet part of him, a part he didn't fully understand, felt compelled to discover what Emmanuel represented, what power he seemed to possess that could make other slaves react with such visceral fear. They arrived at Bellwood on a Thursday evening in late April. The plantation house was a modest Greek revival structure, white columns supporting a second-story veranda, magnolia trees lining the approach. It wasn't grand by Mississippi standards, nothing like the enormous estates that lined the river further north, but it represented prosperity and status that Nathaniel had inherited and maintained through careful, if uninspired, management. His wife, Margaret, met him on the front steps. She was 28, pale and thin, with the delicate constitution that was considered fashionable among wealthy Southern women. Their marriage was companionable if not passionate, built on mutual understanding of social obligation rather than any particular affection. Margaret ran the household with efficient detachment, maintaining the standards appropriate to their station without ever seeming particularly invested in the life those standards represented. "You're back earlier than expected," Margaret said, accepting his brief kiss on her cheek. "Were the auctions productive?" "I acquired 7 slaves," Nathaniel replied. 6 field hands and 1 house servant. "We don't need more house servants. We have adequate staff. This one is different. Experienced, mature. I thought he could assist with managing the others. Perhaps train some of the younger slaves in proper household procedures." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. She had excellent instincts for reading Nathaniel's evasions. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing of consequence. I simply made a purchase that seemed advantageous at the time." "Show me." Nathaniel led her to the wagon where Emmanuel waited, still chained, sitting with perfect stillness that somehow seemed more unnerving than movement. When Margaret saw him, her expression changed immediately. The polite distance that usually characterized her interactions with slaves vanished, replaced by something Nathaniel couldn't quite identify. Recognition? No, that was impossible. She'd never been to Louisiana, never had contact with Auguste Fontaine or his household. "Where did you find him?" Margaret asked quietly. "Charleston. Estate sale from a Louisiana planter. His name is Emmanuel. He has experience in household management." "His name is not Emmanuel." Margaret's voice had gone flat, the way it did when she was deeply disturbed but attempting to maintain composure. "Or if it is, it's not the only name he carries." "What are you talking about?" Margaret turned to face Nathaniel fully. "My grandmother was from New Orleans. She told me stories when I was a child, stories about the old practices that came from Africa, about slaves who maintained the knowledge their captors tried to beat out of them. She described men who carried marks like that, 3 lines on each cheek. Those marks mean he's a priest, a keeper of old knowledge. Do you understand what you've brought into our home?" "Folktales," Nathaniel said, but his conviction was wavering. "Superstition. Look at his eyes, Nathaniel. Really look at them." Nathaniel did. Emmanuel stared back at him with that same unsettling intensity, and for just a moment Nathaniel felt as though he were the one being evaluated, weighed, judged, as though Emmanuel knew something about him that he didn't know himself. "Unchain him," Margaret said suddenly. "Put him in the east guest room, not the slave quarters. Not yet." That's highly irregular. The slaves will see it as weakness. The slaves already fear him. Did you not notice that? Did you not see how they avoid even looking in his direction? They know what he is. We need to understand it too, before we assign him quarters with the others. Nathaniel wanted to argue, wanted to assert his authority, and insist that Emmanuel be treated like any other slave. But Margaret's instincts about household management had always been sound, and her genuine unease was unlike anything he'd seen from her before. Very well. One night. Then we'll reassess. Emmanuel was brought into the house through the back entrance, his chains removed by guards who handled him as little as possible. He was led upstairs to a small guest room, normally reserved for visiting family members of moderate importance. It contained a proper bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the plantation's eastern fields. Nathaniel visited him there after dinner. He found Emmanuel standing at the window, looking out over the rows of cotton plants where slaves were still working in the fading light, their songs drifting up through the humid air. "Why did your previous owners die?" Nathaniel asked without preamble. Emmanuel turned from the window. "Because they tried to own what cannot be owned. Because they believed power came from chains and whips, when true power comes from understanding. Because they looked at me and saw property instead of seeing what I actually am. And what are you? I am a Babalao, a priest of Ifa. I carry knowledge that survived the Middle Passage, wisdom that predates your nation's existence by thousands of years. Your people took our bodies, but they could never take what we carried here." Emmanuel tapped his temple. "Or here." He placed his hand over his heart. "That's blasphemy. Christianity is the only true faith. Christianity is your faith. Mine is older, and unlike yours, mine actually works." Nathaniel felt anger rising. "Careful. I can have you whipped for such talk." "You can. Auguste Fontaine whipped me 17 times in the first month I lived in his house. He wanted to break me, to force me to abandon what I am." Emmanuel's expression remained calm. He died 3 weeks after the 17th whipping. His heart simply stopped beating while he sat at dinner. The doctors found no explanation. Coincidence? Before Fontaine, I belonged to a man named Charles Bro. He tried a different approach. He wanted to learn what I knew, to possess my knowledge the way he possessed my body. Emmanuel shook his head slowly. His mind broke. "Last I heard, he was in an asylum in New Orleans, convinced that ancestral spirits were speaking through the walls of his cell." "You're threatening me." "I'm simply telling you the history you purchased along with my body. You asked why my previous owners died. I'm answering honestly." Emmanuel moved closer, and Nathaniel found himself fighting the urge to step backward. "Men like you believe ownership means control. But some things cannot be controlled, only respected. Some knowledge cannot be dominated, only honored. Your society has built itself on the delusion that you can own other human beings. I am living proof of why that delusion is dangerous." Nathaniel stared at this slave who spoke with the authority of a philosopher, who moved with the confidence of a free man despite his legal status. Every instinct told him to reassert dominance, to remind Emmanuel of his place. But a deeper instinct, one he didn't fully understand, warned him that conventional responses wouldn't work here. "What do you want?" Nathaniel finally asked. Emmanuel smiled slightly. "What do I want? Freedom would be the obvious answer. But I learned long ago that freedom in your society is an illusion. Free men of color in the South are only marginally less oppressed than slaves. So instead, I want what I've always wanted. To practice my traditions, to serve my orishas, to maintain the knowledge my grandfather entrusted to me before he died in the cane fields of Saint-Domingue. Let me do that, and I will serve your household faithfully. Try to break me, and you'll learn why 7 men have failed before you." The audacity of the proposal left Nathaniel momentarily speechless. A slave was negotiating terms of his servitude, stating conditions as though he had any right to do so. It violated every principle Nathaniel had been raised to accept. And yet something in Emmanuel's absolute certainty made refusal feel dangerous. "I'll consider it," Nathaniel said finally, retreating from the room before Emmanuel could sense how shaken he truly was. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. He lay beside Margaret in their bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the plantation at night, but his mind churned with images of Emmanuel's scarred face, with the memory of that unsettling smile, with the fundamental challenge Emmanuel represented to everything Nathaniel understood about power and ownership. Around 3 in the morning, Nathaniel rose and walked to his study. He poured himself whiskey and tried to think clearly about his situation. He'd purchased a troublesome slave, nothing more. The solution was simple. Sell him, or break him, or if necessary, make an example of him that would discourage any other slaves from similar presumption. But even as he formed these thoughts, Nathaniel knew he wouldn't act on them, because beneath his rational mind, in some deeper place he barely acknowledged, he already sensed what would take him months to fully understand. Emmanuel was right. Some things couldn't be owned. Some knowledge couldn't be controlled. And Nathaniel Crowder, unremarkable cotton planter, adequate master, had accidentally purchased a doorway into a reality he'd spent his entire life refusing to see. Outside his study window, in the slave quarters where Emmanuel should have been chained but wasn't, drums began to beat. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing gradually louder. The rhythm was complex, layered, nothing like the simple call and response patterns Nathaniel had heard from field slaves during their rare moments of permitted celebration. This was different. This was language. This was prayer. And as Nathaniel listened, he realized that every slave on his plantation was awake and listening too. The normal sounds of the quarters, the usual restlessness and whispered conversations that characterized the hours before dawn, had gone completely silent. Everyone was listening to those drums. Everyone was hearing something Nathaniel couldn't quite comprehend. He finished his whiskey and returned to bed, but sleep never came. And somewhere in the guest room above the slaves' quarters, Emmanuel sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in a language that predated English by millennia, calling to forces that predated slavery itself, beginning a process that would transform Bellwood Plantation into the site of America's most suppressed and terrifying historical mystery. The transformation of Bellwood Plantation began with small things. Details that Nathaniel noticed but couldn't quite explain. The field slaves worked with renewed energy despite the brutal heat of May. Productivity increased by nearly 20% within 2 weeks of Emmanuel's arrival, though Thomas Garrett, the overseer, reported using the whip less frequently than usual. The slaves seemed to move with purpose rather than the sullen resistance that typically characterized forced labor. They sang different songs, older songs in languages Garrett didn't recognize and couldn't silence because the work was being done. Emmanuel himself had been assigned to household duties after that first unsettling night. Margaret had insisted on it, claiming she wanted to observe him closely, to understand what made him different from other slaves. He served at meals, cleaned the main rooms, and performed his duties with such flawless efficiency that the other house slaves began watching him with the same wary reverence the field workers displayed. He never spoke unless addressed, never showed the slightest hint of insubordination, and yet his presence dominated every space he occupied. Nathaniel found himself watching Emmanuel constantly. During meals, he would track the slaves' movements around the table, noting the precise grace of his gestures, the way he seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced. During the long afternoons, when Nathaniel worked in his study on plantation accounts, he would sense Emmanuel's presence in adjacent rooms and find his concentration fracturing, his mind drifting toward questions he couldn't quite formulate. Margaret noticed her husband's distraction. One evening in mid-May, as they prepared for bed, she confronted him directly. "You're obsessed with him," she said, her voice carrying neither judgment nor concern, simply observation. "You watch him constantly. You find excuses to be in whatever room he's working in. What are you looking for?" Nathaniel wanted to deny it, but Margaret had always been unnervingly perceptive. "I'm trying to understand him. He's unlike any slave I've ever encountered. There's something about him that doesn't fit the natural order of things. The natural order is an invention of men who needed to justify their cruelty. My grandmother taught me that. She said the old knowledge, the practices that came from Africa, they recognized powers that Christianity refuses to acknowledge. Perhaps Emmanuel carries some of that power. Perhaps that's what you're sensing. You sound like you believe it. That's dangerous talk, Margaret. If anyone heard you suggesting that Negro superstitions held actual power, that slaves might possess knowledge superior to whites, our reputation would be destroyed. Our reputation is built on the fiction that human beings can be property. Margaret's voice had gone cold. I've never questioned that fiction publicly because I understand the consequences of doing so. But privately, Nathaniel, I've always known it was a lie, and I think you're beginning to know it too. That's why Emmanuel frightens you, because he forces you to see what you've spent your entire life refusing to acknowledge. The conversation ended there, but it marked a shift in their marriage. Margaret withdrew into a cool distance, spending more time in her rooms, leaving Nathaniel alone with his increasingly obsessive thoughts about Emmanuel and what the slave represented. In early June, approximately 6 weeks after Emmanuel's arrival, the first death occurred. One of the field hands, a young man named Samuel, who'd been known for his strength and reliability, collapsed while working. The other slaves carried him to the quarters, where he died within hours. His body showed no signs of injury or disease. He simply stopped breathing, as though something vital had been extracted from him. Thomas Garrett reported the death to Nathaniel with barely concealed unease. "The Negroes are saying it's connected to Emmanuel, sir, saying that Samuel disrespected one of the old rituals, spoke against what they're calling the Babalao. Now they're all terrified." That's absurd. Men die from heat exhaustion, from overwork. It's unfortunate but not supernatural. With respect, sir, Samuel wasn't overworked. He'd been resting in the shade when it happened. And the other slaves, they're saying his soul was taken. That's the exact phrase they keep using. His soul was taken as payment. Payment for what? Garrett hesitated. For Emmanuel's protection, sir. They believe he's under the watch of spirits, that anyone who threatens him or disrupts his work will face the same fate. It's making them afraid to work near him, afraid to even look at him. Nathaniel should have dismissed this as ignorant superstition. Instead, he found himself walking to the slave quarters that evening, something he rarely did. The quarters consisted of a series of small cabins arranged in 2 rows, basic structures that provided minimal shelter, but nothing resembling comfort. As Nathaniel approached, he heard singing, but not the spirituals or work songs he was accustomed to. These were older sounds, rhythmic chanting in what might have been Yoruba or another West African language, accompanied by hand drums and the shake of something that sounded like dried gourds filled with seeds. He found Emmanuel in the center of a gathering, surrounded by perhaps 20 slaves who sat in a careful circle around him. Emmanuel held a staff carved with intricate patterns, symbols Nathaniel didn't recognize. He was speaking, his voice rising and falling in a cadence that felt almost hypnotic, and the slaves around him responded at intervals with phrases that sounded like affirmations or prayers. Nathaniel stepped forward, intending to stop this gathering, to reassert authority. But as he moved into the firelight, Emmanuel's eyes found him, and the priest, the Babalawo, smiled. "You're welcome to join us, Master Crowder. We're honoring those who came before, those who survived the crossing, those who maintained the knowledge despite every effort to break them. This is forbidden. Slaves gathering like this, practicing heathen rituals, I could have you all whipped." "You could," Emmanuel's voice remained calm, "but you won't, because you're beginning to understand that what we practice here is older and deeper than your laws. You're beginning to feel it yourself, aren't you? The pull, the recognition that the world is larger than what you've been taught." The other slaves watched this exchange with expressions Nathaniel couldn't read. Fear, certainly, but also something else. Hope, perhaps, or anticipation. "Samuel's death was natural," Nathaniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It had nothing to do with your rituals or threats." Samuel mocked what we do here. He called me a fraud, said I was just an old man filling their heads with African foolishness. Emmanuel gestured to the assembled slaves. 2 days later, his soul departed. I took no action against him. I didn't need to. The Orishas defend their own. You're claiming you killed him. I'm claiming that I am protected by forces your Christianity refuses to acknowledge. I'm claiming that your society's attempt to strip us of our beliefs, our practices, our knowledge, has failed. We carried it across the ocean in our minds, in our songs, in the patterns we weave and the rhythms we beat. You can own our bodies, Master Crowder, but you'll never own what lives inside them. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him at those words. A recognition he didn't want to accept. A understanding that Emmanuel was right about the fundamental limitation of slavery. You could chain a body, force it to labor, claim legal ownership, but the mind, the soul, the essential self, these remained free, no matter what papers said, no matter what laws enforced. He turned and walked away from the gathering without issuing any punishment or prohibition. Behind him, the chanting resumed, and Nathaniel felt as though he'd lost something crucial in that moment, some piece of the certainty that had always defined his understanding of his place in the world. That night, he dreamed of Emmanuel for the first time. In the dream, the slave stood in a forest clearing, surrounded by figures that seemed to shimmer between human and animal forms. Emmanuel spoke in that unknown language, and Nathaniel understood every word, despite never having heard the tongue before. The Babalawo was explaining the nature of power, the difference between dominance and authority, between force and true sovereignty. And in the dream, Nathaniel found himself kneeling, not in submission, but in recognition of something greater than himself. He woke in a cold sweat, disturbed by the dream's intensity and by the lingering sense that it hadn't been merely a dream at all. That Emmanuel had somehow reached into his sleeping mind and planted those images, those ideas, those fundamental challenges to everything Nathaniel believed about hierarchy and power. The summer deepened, and with it, Nathaniel's obsession grew. He began asking Emmanuel questions during their brief interactions. First about practical matters, household management, the best methods for organizing servants. But gradually, inevitably, his questions turned more personal, more philosophical. He wanted to know about the practices Emmanuel maintained, about the beliefs that governed his worldview, about this system called Ifa that supposedly predated Christianity. Emmanuel answered carefully at first, offering fragments of information that left Nathaniel hungry for more. The priest seemed to understand that knowledge given too freely would be devalued, that the slow revelation of hidden wisdom would prove more seductive than any sudden exposure. He spoke of Orishas, divine forces that governed different aspects of existence. He explained the concept of Ashe, a spiritual power that flowed through all things. He described divination practices that could reveal the future, rituals that could alter the course of events, sacrifices that could appease or summon forces beyond human comprehension. "Your Bible speaks of miracles," Emmanuel said during one of these conversations, "but it claims they ended with the apostles. My tradition says the miraculous is always present, always accessible to those who know how to see it, how to work with it. Your God is distant, abstract, requiring faith without evidence. My Orishas are immediate, tangible, responsive to those who serve them properly." "That's blasphemy," Nathaniel said, but with less conviction than before. "Is it, or is it simply a different understanding of the divine? Your people enslaved mine, forced us to practice Christianity, but we didn't abandon our truths. We hid them inside your religion, worshipped our Orishas under the names of your saints. You thought you'd converted us, but we simply learned to speak 2 languages. Emmanuel's smile was knowing. "And now you want to learn the older language. That's why you keep seeking me out. That's why you dream of things you can't explain. How do you know about my dreams? Because I send them. because you're being prepared for something you don't yet understand, because the Orishas have marked you as someone who needs to learn what your society has tried to destroy. Nathaniel should have been terrified, should have recognized this as manipulation, as a slave attempting to exert inappropriate influence over his master. Instead, he felt a strange excitement, a hunger to understand what Emmanuel was offering. The world had always seemed so fixed, so predetermined by social hierarchy and racial superiority, but Emmanuel was suggesting that reality was more fluid, more negotiable, more open to those who possessed the right knowledge. In July, 2 more deaths occurred at Bellwood. Both were field hands who'd reportedly spoken against Emmanuel, who'd tried to convince other slaves to avoid his rituals, to maintain their Christian faith instead of returning to African practices. Like Samuel, they died suddenly, without injury or obvious illness. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Thomas Garrett came to Nathaniel's study, his face pale. "Sir, we need to do something about Emmanuel. The slaves are convinced he's killing anyone who opposes him. They're terrified. Some are talking about running. We could lose our entire workforce if this continues. Emmanuel hasn't touched anyone. I've watched him carefully. He performs his duties, participates in these gatherings, but takes no violent action. That's exactly what makes it so frightening, sir. If he was just a murderer, we could handle that. Chain him, punish him, make an example. But this looks like witchcraft. Looks like he's commanding powers that can kill from a distance. The slaves believe it absolutely, and I'm starting to wonder if they might be right. You're telling me you believe in Negro magic, that you think Emmanuel can kill with curses? I'm telling you that 3 healthy men are dead, sir. 3 men who all opposed the same slave. That's not coincidence, that's pattern. And patterns mean cause, even if we don't understand the mechanism. Nathaniel dismissed Garrett, but the overseer's words lingered. 3 deaths, 3 opponents of Emmanuel's practices. The rational explanation would be coincidence. Perhaps some disease that affected only certain individuals, perhaps even the stress of resisting social pressure from the other slaves. But Nathaniel found himself increasingly unable to accept rational explanations where Emmanuel was concerned. That evening, he confronted the Babalao directly. They were alone in the house. Margaret had retired early with one of her headaches, and the other servants had been dismissed to their quarters. Nathaniel had been drinking whiskey, trying to quiet the questions that consumed him, when Emmanuel entered the study to bank the fire for the night. "Did you kill those men?" Nathaniel asked, without preamble. Emmanuel paused in his work, his back to Nathaniel. "What would you do if I said yes? I'd have you arrested, tried, hanged." "No, you wouldn't." Emmanuel turned to face him. "Because you want what I have. You want the knowledge, the power, the certainty that comes from understanding how reality actually works beneath the lies your society has constructed. You've been drinking tonight because you can't stop thinking about it, can't stop wondering what would happen if you submitted to what I represent. I would never submit to a slave. Then you misunderstand the nature of what I'm offering." Emmanuel moved closer, and Nathaniel found himself unable to retreat. This isn't about social hierarchy or racial superiority. This is about recognizing that some forces transcend human categories. The Orishas don't care about skin color or legal status. They care about service, about devotion, about respect. I've told you that some things cannot be owned, only honored. Are you ready to understand what that means? Tell me about the deaths. Tell me the truth. The truth is complex. Emmanuel sat down, an act that would normally be unthinkable for a slave in his master's study. But Nathaniel didn't protest. The men who died were blocking spiritual work that needs to happen here. They were preventing other slaves from accessing practices that sustain them, that give them dignity and power despite their bondage. I prayed to Oya, the Orisha of storms and transformation. I asked her to remove obstacles. She answered, "That's not murder. That's divine justice. You're admitting you caused their deaths. I'm admitting that I petitioned forces greater than myself, and those forces acted." Emmanuel's eyes held Nathaniel's gaze. And here's what frightens you most. You've been watching the results. You've seen men die for defying spiritual authority. And some part of you recognizes that this power is real, is effective, is superior to the empty Christianity you practice every Sunday without truly believing. That's not true. I have faith. You have habit, you have social obligation, but you don't have faith. If you did, you wouldn't be here asking me these questions. You wouldn't be dreaming of orishas and ancient forests. You wouldn't be slowly, inevitably recognizing that everything you've been taught about power and hierarchy is built on delusion. Nathaniel stood abruptly, knocking over his whiskey glass. You forget yourself. You're a slave. You exist at my pleasure. I could have you destroyed with a word. Then do it. Emmanuel remained seated, utterly calm. Call for Garrett. Order my execution. End this conversation and return to your comfortable lies. Or admit what you've known since Charleston. That purchasing me was the beginning of your education into a reality you've spent 34 years refusing to see. The silence stretched between them. Nathaniel's hand trembled. His mind raced through options, responses, ways to reassert the proper order of things. But beneath his panic, beneath his anger, a deeper part of him recognized that Emmanuel was right. Something fundamental had shifted in Nathaniel's understanding of the world. The certainties that had always governed his life, the assumptions about white superiority and black inferiority, about masters and slaves, about power and submission, all of it suddenly seemed desperately fragile, performative rather than true. Teach me, Nathaniel heard himself say, the words emerging before he could stop them. Show me what you know. Emmanuel's smile was terrible in its gentleness. Oh, Master Crowder, I've been teaching you since the moment you purchased me. I've been showing you since the first night you dreamed. Now the real education begins. Now you'll learn what happens when a man raised on lies finally encounters truth. But be warned, what you're asking for cannot be taken back. Once you see clearly, you can never return to comfortable blindness. Once you acknowledge the orishas, they'll expect devotion. Are you truly ready for that? Nathaniel nodded, not trusting his voice. And in that moment, in that gesture of agreement, the master of Bellwood Plantation began his transformation into something his society had no language to describe. A white man learning to worship forces his culture had tried to destroy. A plantation owner kneeling before knowledge carried by the very people he claimed to own. A man discovering that the only thing more terrifying than slavery's brutality was the truth slavery had been designed to suppress. That some powers could never be conquered. Some knowledge could never be erased. And some people, no matter how thoroughly degraded by bondage, carried within them a sovereignty that no chains could touch. Emmanuel stood, gestured toward the door. Come with me. There's something you need to see. Nathaniel followed, leaving his study, his whiskey, his pretense of authority. He followed Emmanuel through the dark house and out into the humid night, toward the slave quarters where drums were already beginning to beat, where his slaves, his property, his human livestock were practicing something older than his nation, older than Christianity, older than the entire murderous fiction of racial hierarchy. He followed because he couldn't stop himself, because Emmanuel had awakened a hunger for truth that overwhelmed every other consideration. Because after 34 years of comfortable lies, Nathaniel Crowder had finally encountered something real, and that reality was about to destroy everything he'd ever believed about himself and his place in the world. The gathering that night would mark the point of no return for Nathaniel Crowder. Emmanuel led him past the main slave quarters to a clearing in the woods beyond the cotton fields, a space Nathaniel had never known existed, despite owning this land for 8 years. The path was narrow, barely visible, marked only by stones that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness with what might have been phosphorescence or something less easily explained. Approximately 40 slaves had gathered in the clearing, nearly every adult who lived on Bellwood Plantation. They'd built a fire in the center, and around it they'd arranged 7 clay bowls, each containing substances Nathaniel couldn't identify, herbs, perhaps, oils, something that looked disturbingly like blood. The slaves formed a circle around these elements, and when Emmanuel appeared with Nathaniel following behind him, a collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly. Thomas Garrett would have seen this as rebellion, as conspiracy, as everything that justified the brutal controls slavery required. But Nathaniel, approaching with Emmanuel's guidance, saw something entirely different. He saw community. He saw worship. He saw people who'd been stripped of everything except what they carried inside themselves, now expressing that interior world with a dignity and power that made the white man's Sunday services seem hollow by comparison. Emmanuel moved to the center of the circle and began speaking in Yoruba. Nathaniel understood none of the words, but the meaning penetrated anyway. This was invocation. This was prayer to forces that predated the names white men had given to divine power. The slaves responded at intervals, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to resonate in Nathaniel's chest, in his bones, in some part of him that had never been touched by Sunday school lessons or plantation social hierarchies. Then Emmanuel switched to English, clearly for Nathaniel's benefit. Tonight we honor Shango, the Orisha of thunder, of fire, of masculine power and judgment. We honor him, and we ask him to witness something unprecedented in this land of bondage. A master who seeks to become a student, a white man who wishes to kneel before knowledge his people have tried to destroy. Nathaniel felt every eye turn toward him. The slaves stared with expressions ranging from disbelief to something approaching pity. They knew what he was about to do, even if he didn't fully comprehend it himself. They knew that once he crossed this threshold, the world would never again make sense in the way it had for his entire life. Emmanuel handed Nathaniel a clay cup filled with bitter liquid. "Drink," the Babalawo commanded, "and as you drink, understand that you're consuming medicine that will open your eyes to what has always been here, but hidden from you. You'll see the spirits that walk alongside us. You'll understand the connections between all living things. You'll recognize that the hierarchy you've believed in is illusion, and what lies beneath it is far more complex and far more terrifying than anything your Bible describes." Nathaniel raised the cup. His hands shook. Some part of him screamed that this was madness, that he should drop the cup and run back to the house, back to Margaret and respectability and the comfortable delusions of white supremacy. But a deeper part of him, the part that had been growing stronger since Charleston, urged him forward. Drink, learn, see. He drank. The liquid burned his throat, tasted of earth and rot and something metallic. His stomach convulsed, but he kept it down through sheer will. Emmanuel smiled and began chanting again, this time in a rhythm that matched Nathaniel's suddenly racing heartbeat. The effects came gradually at first. The firelight seemed to intensify, throwing shadows that moved independent of the flames. The slaves' faces began to shift, their features overlaying with other faces, older faces, perhaps the ancestors they were constantly invoking. Nathaniel saw a young woman transform momentarily into an elderly crone before shifting back. He saw a field hand's eyes glow with an amber light that had no source. Then the visions deepened. The clearing expanded impossibly, becoming a vast space that held more than the physical dimensions should allow. Figures emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight. Not human, not quite, but possessing human-like forms wrapped in lightning, in wind, in water that moved with conscious intention. These were the Orishas, Nathaniel realized, with a terror that paradoxically felt like recognition. These were the powers Emmanuel served, the forces that had protected him, that had killed those who opposed him, that now observed Nathaniel with what might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. One figure stepped forward from this impossible assembly, massive, draped in red and white cloth, carrying a double-headed axe that crackled with actual electricity. This was Shango, the Orisha Emmanuel had invoked, the thunder deity, the judge of men. He moved toward Nathaniel with steps that shook the ground, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of storms breaking over mountains. You come seeking knowledge, the voice said, speaking English but with an accent older than the language itself. You come as a master who enslaves my children. Why should I teach one who profits from their suffering? Nathaniel tried to speak, but his throat had closed with fear. Emmanuel placed a hand on his shoulder, and the touch somehow gave him strength. I come because I've seen that my understanding is false, Nathaniel managed. I come because I want to know the truth, even if that truth destroys me. Shango's laughter was thunder. Destroys you? It will not destroy you, little master. It will transform you into something your society has no name for. You will become a bridge between worlds, a white man who serves black gods, a slave owner who kneels before the enslaved. Your neighbors will call you mad, your wife will abandon you. Your reputation will become a cautionary tale whispered in parlors across the South, and yet you say you seek this knowledge? I do. Then kneel. Nathaniel knelt. There, in the clearing, surrounded by his slaves, watched by forces he'd been taught didn't exist, the master of Bellwood Plantation pressed his forehead to the earth and acknowledged powers greater than himself. He felt something break inside him, some structure that had held his identity together for 34 years. The certainty of white superiority, the comfort of seeing himself as civilized while viewing others as savage, the entire edifice of beliefs that justified slavery and racial hierarchy, all of it crumbled like a building with no foundation. When he raised his head, tears streamed down his face. The Orishas had retreated back into the darkness, but their presence remained palpable. Emmanuel stood before him, no longer a slave, but revealed in his true nature as priest, as keeper of ancient wisdom, as someone who wielded power that made legal ownership seem like the pathetic fiction it had always been. Now you begin to see, Emmanuel said quietly. Now you understand why 7 masters before you failed to own me. You cannot own what you do not comprehend. You cannot enslave what is sovereign in ways your laws will never recognize. Rise, Nathaniel Crowder. Rise as a different man than you were when you knelt. Nathaniel stood on shaking legs. The other slaves watched him with expressions he'd never seen directed at him before. Not fear, not resentment, but something approaching compassion. They'd all been where he was now, he realized. They'd all experienced the shattering of one worldview and the painful birth of another. The difference was that they'd been forced into that transformation through the violence of capture and enslavement. He was choosing it, seeking it out, desperately trying to grasp knowledge that his people had spent generations trying to destroy. The ceremony continued for hours. Nathaniel participated where Emmanuel instructed, observed in silence when told to simply watch and learn. He saw divination performed with cowrie shells that fell in patterns revealing past and future. He witnessed offerings made to different Orishas, each receiving specific foods, specific songs, specific gestures of respect. He heard stories of survival, of how these practices had been maintained through the Middle Passage, through plantation brutality, through systematic attempts to erase African identity from the enslaved. And he began to understand that slavery had never been the simple equation of power he'd believed it to be. The enslaved had always maintained inner sovereignty, had always possessed knowledge and practices that their captors could neither comprehend nor eliminate. When the ceremony finally ended near dawn, Emmanuel walked Nathaniel back toward the main house. They moved in silence until they reached the veranda, where the slave finally spoke. What you experienced tonight will fade somewhat in the daylight. The medicine's effects will wear off, and your rational mind will reassert itself. You'll question whether what you saw was real or hallucination. That's natural, but the transformation has begun, and it cannot be stopped. You've acknowledged powers your people deny. You've knelt before forces your religion calls demonic. There's no returning from that threshold, Master Crowder. You belong to the Orishas now, whether you accept it or not. What happens next? Nathaniel asked, his voice hoarse from chanting and smoke and terror. You continue your education. You learn properly, systematically, under my guidance. And in time, you'll serve these forces openly, regardless of what your society thinks. Emmanuel's expression was unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. But be warned, the path ahead will cost you everything. Your wife, your reputation, your place in white society. The Orishas demand total commitment, half measures offend them, and those who offend them, his voice dropped to a whisper, do not survive long. Nathaniel climbed the steps to his house, entered through the front door he'd exited hours earlier, and immediately knew something had changed. Margaret stood in the front hall, still dressed in her nightclothes, her face pale and drawn. She'd been waiting for him. "Where were you?" she asked. "With Emmanuel. In the woods. At a ceremony." Margaret closed her eyes as though receiving news of a death. "I smelled the smoke from my bedroom window. I heard the drums. And I knew you'd gone to them." Her voice broke. "My grandmother warned me about this. She said that sometimes the knowledge calls to people who have no right to it, people whose souls hunger for truth, even when truth will destroy them. She said those people become bridges, and bridges are always walked upon, always bearing weight between two worlds, always suffering for their position." Nathaniel reached for her, but Margaret stepped back. "Don't. I can smell it on you. The herbs, the offerings, the spirits you've been consorting with. You're marked now, Nathaniel. Claimed by forces I grew up fearing and respecting from a safe distance. I won't try to stop you. I know it's too late for that. But I won't accompany you on this path either. You'll do this alone. Margaret, please try to understand. I do understand. That's the tragedy. I understand exactly what's happening to you, and I know it's irreversible." She gathered her composure with visible effort. "I'll remain your wife in public. I'll maintain the household, play my role for society. But our marriage, our actual partnership, that ends now. You've chosen gods over me, ancient powers over our life together. I can't compete with that, and I won't try." She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Nathaniel alone in the hallway as morning light began filtering through the windows. He should have felt loss, should have mourned the death of his marriage. Instead, he felt only a strange sense of inevitability. Margaret was right. He'd crossed a threshold that separated him from everything he'd been before. There was no returning, no rebuilding what he'd willingly destroyed in pursuit of knowledge his society insisted didn't exist. Over the following weeks, Nathaniel's transformation accelerated. He spent hours each day with Emmanuel, learning the principles of Ifa, the system of divination and wisdom that governed Yoruba spiritual practice. He learned about the 16 major Odu, the sacred verses that contained all knowledge, all possibility. He learned to identify different Orishas, to understand their preferences, their domains, their personalities. He learned sacrifice, not the blood sacrifice that terrified white Christians, but the more profound sacrifice of ego, of certainty, of the comfortable lies that made slavery psychologically possible. The plantation continued to function, but its nature changed. Thomas Garrett reported that the slaves worked with renewed purpose, that productivity remained high despite Nathaniel's strange new habits. But the overseer also noted with growing alarm that the normal disciplinary methods no longer seemed necessary or effective. The slaves had reorganized themselves around Emmanuel's leadership. They deferred to the Babalawo in all matters, spiritual and practical, and Garrett's authority existed only at Emmanuel's sufferance. "I've lost control, sir," Garrett admitted during one particularly tense meeting. "They don't see me as overseer anymore. They barely acknowledge me. And when I try to enforce discipline, Emmanuel intervenes. He doesn't do it openly, doesn't challenge me directly. But somehow, every time I order a punishment, something prevents it. The whip breaks. The chains unlock themselves. Once, I swear, a locked shed door simply opened when a slave I'd confined prayed to one of their African gods. I can't work under these conditions." Nathaniel should have supported his overseer, should have re-established the brutal hierarchies that made plantation slavery possible. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Perhaps we don't need the kind of control you're accustomed to exercising. The work is being done, the slaves are healthier and more productive than ever. Maybe force was never as necessary as we believed." Garrett stared at him with undisguised horror. "Sir, are you hearing yourself? You're talking like an abolitionist, like someone who's forgotten that these are slaves, not employees. We can't run a plantation on goodwill and African superstition. What if the superstition is more real than the systems we've built? What if we've been wrong about everything, Thomas? About power, about control, about what actually makes human beings work effectively?" The overseer stood abruptly. "I won't be part of whatever this is. You've gone mad, Mr. Crowder. That Negro has done something to your mind, twisted you into something unnatural. I'm leaving Bellwood. I suggest you find someone else to manage your property, because I can't watch this degradation anymore." Garrett departed that afternoon, abandoning a position he'd held for 12 years. Word of his leaving spread quickly through the neighboring plantations, and with it came rumors. Nathaniel Crowder had become unstable. He'd fallen under the influence of a slave who practiced witchcraft. He'd been seen participating in Negro rituals, kneeling before his own property, speaking of African gods as though they were real. The rumors reached a crisis point when 4 more deaths occurred at Bellwood within a single week. This time, the dead weren't slaves, but white men. A merchant who'd come to negotiate cotton prices collapsed on Nathaniel's front steps, blood streaming from his eyes. A neighboring planter who'd come to express concern about the rumors died in his carriage on the way home, his heart apparently exploding in his chest. A minister who'd attempted to hold an intervention, to pray over Nathaniel and cast out whatever demons possessed him, hanged himself from a tree on the property line, though no one could explain how he'd tied the knot that killed him. And a doctor who'd examined the bodies, who'd written a report suggesting some kind of poisoning or disease, was found dead in his office with all his papers burned to ash and a single African symbol painted in blood on his wall. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who threatened Emmanuel, anyone who tried to separate Nathaniel from the Babalawo's influence, anyone who attempted to expose or stop what was happening at Bellwood, died. And they died in ways that suggested supernatural agency, that defied rational explanation, that terrified everyone who learned the details. The white community's response was swift and desperate. A delegation of planters and town officials arrived at Bellwood in late August, determined to confront Nathaniel and, if necessary, remove Emmanuel by force. They found Nathaniel in the main parlor, dressed in white robes instead of his usual gentleman's clothing, his face painted with white chalk in patterns that mimicked the scarification on Emmanuel's cheeks. "Mr. Crowder," the delegation's leader began, a prominent planter named Harrison Thorne, "we've come to discuss the situation at your plantation. There are concerns, serious concerns, about your welfare and the influence certain of your slaves may be exerting over you." Nathaniel looked at them with eyes that seemed to see through them to something beyond. "You're here to save me from Negro magic. You're here to reassert the proper order, to remind me that white men don't kneel before black gods. Is that the substance of your concern, gentlemen?" The bluntness of his response unsettled them. "Yes," Thorne admitted. "We're here because you've abandoned your position, your duty, your race. You've allowed a slave to corrupt you into practices that are abhorrent to God and civilization. We're asking you to send this Emmanuel away, to cleanse your household of these heathen influences, and to return to Christian society. And if I refuse, then we'll take action ourselves. We'll remove the slave by force if necessary. We'll have you examined by doctors to determine your mental fitness. We cannot allow this degradation to continue, Nathaniel. You're setting an example that threatens the entire foundation of our society." Nathaniel stood, and as he did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The men in the delegation felt it, several pulling their coats tighter despite the August heat. "Your society is built on the delusion that you can own other human beings," Nathaniel said quietly. "That you can strip them of culture, identity, knowledge, and reduce them to tools. But you can't. You've never been able to. The knowledge survived, the practices survived, the gods survived, and now I've seen them, gentlemen. I've knelt before them, I've felt their power, and I tell you with absolute certainty that everything we've built here in the South Every plantation, every auction block, every law that says one human can own another, all of it is illusion. Comfortable, profitable illusion. But illusion nonetheless. "You're insane," one of the men whispered. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm the only one seeing clearly. Emmanuel taught me that wisdom often looks like madness to those who cling to lies. You're welcome to try removing him. You're welcome to try restoring what you call proper order. But I warn you, gentlemen, the Orishas protect their servants, and they've claimed me as thoroughly as they've always claimed Emmanuel." The delegation left without taking action, too unnerved by Nathaniel's transformation and too frightened by the mysterious deaths that had plagued anyone who opposed the Babalao. But they reported back to the broader community, and a decision was made. Bellwood Plantation would be quarantined. No one would trade with Nathaniel Crowder. No one would visit his property. The Postal Service was instructed to avoid the estate. Bellwood would be treated as though it had been struck by plague, isolated, and left to collapse under its own accumulated madness. By September, Nathaniel's education was complete. He could read the Dialogun, the cowrie shell divination system. He could identify the signatures of different Orishas in natural phenomena. He'd learned the prayers, the songs, the sacred stories that Emmanuel had carried across the ocean in his mind, and most significantly, he'd accepted his new role, not as master, but as devotee. Not as owner, but as student of knowledge far older than the nation that had tried to destroy it. Emmanuel summoned him one evening to the clearing where his initiation had begun. The other slaves were absent this time. Just the two of them, priest and convert, standing under stars that seemed impossibly bright. "You've learned well," Emmanuel said. "You've embraced truths that destroyed lesser men. But now comes the final test, the moment that will determine whether your transformation is complete or whether you'll break like the masters before you." "What test?" Emmanuel handed him a knife, simple iron blade with a wooden handle. "The Orishas require sacrifice," he said. "Not animal sacrifice, though that has its place. They require the sacrifice of what you were. The complete death of Nathaniel Crowder, plantation master, so that someone new can be born, someone who serves forces greater than himself, someone who acknowledges that in the true hierarchy of power he stands below those he once claimed to own." Nathaniel held the knife, understanding flooding through him. "You want me to free them, to legally emancipate every slave on this plantation." Not just emancipation. Emmanuel's eyes gleamed in the starlight. "The Orishas want you to kneel publicly, to acknowledge before witnesses that your authority was always fiction, to proclaim that the enslaved are sovereign in ways you'll never achieve. That's the sacrifice they demand. Your reputation, your social standing, your place in white society, everything that made you Master Crowder must die. Only then will your transformation be complete." "If I do this," Nathaniel said slowly, "I'll be destroyed. Financially, socially, perhaps physically. The other planters will see it as madness or treason. They'll find ways to punish me, to take what remains of my property, to erase me from respectable society." "Yes." Emmanuel's voice held no sympathy, only the flat certainty Nathaniel had heard in Charleston so many months ago. This is what I warned you about from the beginning. Ownership is an illusion, but destroying that illusion comes with a price. You must pay that price, or the Orishas will take payment in ways more terrible than social ruin." Nathaniel looked down at the knife in his hand, this symbol of his final choice. He thought of Margaret, already estranged, but still bound to him by law and custom. He thought of the plantation his family had built, the wealth that sustained them, the future that had once seemed so certain and secure. All of it would die if he did what Emmanuel demanded. All of it would be sacrificed to forces his society insisted didn't exist. He thought of the visions he'd seen, the Orishas who'd accepted his worship, the knowledge that had shattered every certainty he'd ever held, and he understood that there was no real choice here. He'd crossed the threshold months ago. Everything since then had been inevitable progression toward this moment. "I'll do it," Nathaniel whispered. "I'll give them what they demand." Emmanuel smiled, and in that smile, Nathanael saw both victory and tragedy. The priest had won, had successfully converted a master into a worshipper, had proven that slavery's power was always more fragile than the knowledge it tried to suppress. But that victory would cost Nathanael everything, would reduce him from prosperous planter to cautionary tale, would make him a ghost in his own life, remembered only as the man who went mad and betrayed his race. "Tomorrow," Emmanuel said. "Tomorrow you'll make your public declaration. Tomorrow Bellwood Plantation becomes something unprecedented in Mississippi. A place where the enslaved claim freedom and the master acknowledges he never had authority at all. Tomorrow, the comfortable illusion dies, and uncomfortable truth takes its place." They stood together in the clearing, master and slave, both roles now meaningless in the face of forces older than slavery itself. And Nathanael understood with terrible clarity that this moment, this sacrifice he was about to make, would be erased from history by people who couldn't afford to acknowledge what it represented. The story would be suppressed, the records altered, the truth buried under comfortable lies that preserved the fiction of white supremacy and black inferiority. But the Orishas would remember. The knowledge would survive. And somewhere in the future, perhaps, someone would uncover the fragments of this story and understand what really happened at Bellwood Plantation in 1838, when a master learned to worship his slave, when comfortable lies met uncomfortable truth, and when the price of that meeting proved more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The morning of September 15th, 1838, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Natchez like a physical weight. Nathanael Crowder woke before sunrise, dressed in the white robes he'd worn for ceremonies, and walked through his house for what he knew would be the last time as its master. Margaret remained in her bedroom, the door locked, refusing to witness what was about to happen. She'd tried once more the previous evening to dissuade him, to appeal to whatever remained of the man she'd married. But Nathanael was no longer that man. The transformation Emmanuel had begun in Charleston was complete. By 9 in the morning, a crowd had gathered at the gates of Bellwood Plantation. Word had spread that Nathanael intended to make some kind of announcement, and the combination of morbid curiosity and genuine concern had drawn planters, merchants, and town officials from across the county. They stood in clusters, whispering among themselves, speculating about what new madness Crowder would display. Some carried weapons, prepared to intervene if the situation demanded it. Others came simply to witness what they hoped would be the final degradation of a man who'd betrayed everything they believed in. Nathanael emerged from the house at precisely 10 o'clock, Emmanuel walking beside him. The sight of them together, master and slave, moving as equals, sent a ripple of disgust through the assembled crowd. But what truly shocked them was Nathanael's appearance. The white robes, the chalk markings on his face, the necklaces of beads in colors that corresponded to different Orishas, all of it proclaimed his allegiance to traditions white society had spent generations trying to destroy. Harrison Thorne stepped forward, his face red with anger and something approaching fear. "Crowder, what is the meaning of this display? Have you no shame left at all?" Nathanael's voice, when he spoke, carried across the crowd with unexpected power. "I've gathered you here to witness the death of a delusion. For 8 years, I've operated this plantation under the belief that I owned the people who worked this land. That belief was false. It's always been false. Ownership of human beings is a legal fiction, a social construct built on violence and maintained through systematic brutality. But it has no reality beyond what we agree to enforce." "You're mad," someone shouted from the crowd. "Possessed by Negro devils." "I'm awake," Nathanael countered. "Perhaps for the first time in my life. Emmanuel, the man you see as my slave, has taught me things your churches deny, your laws suppress, your entire society refuses to acknowledge. He's shown me that power doesn't flow from ownership, but from knowledge. That sovereignty exists in the mind and soul, not in legal documents. That the people we've enslaved have maintained wisdom and practices that make our Christianity seem like the primitive superstition. The crowd's murmurs grew hostile. Several men moved forward, hands on weapons, but Nathaniel raised his hand, and something in his gesture stopped them. Perhaps it was the absolute conviction in his bearing. Perhaps it was fear of what had happened to others who'd tried to interfere with Bellwood's transformation. Or perhaps it was something else, some power that now flowed through Nathaniel, borrowed from the Orishas he'd learned to serve. "Today, I'm signing documents that legally emancipate every enslaved person on this property." Nathaniel produced papers from within his robes. 63 human beings will become free, not as an act of mercy, but as acknowledgement of a truth I should have recognized long ago. They were never mine to own. Their apparent bondage was illusion, maintained only through violence and delusion. The reality is that they've always been sovereign, always maintained knowledge and practices that transcended the chains we placed on their bodies. "You'll be ruined," Thorne said, his voice shaking. "The other planters will destroy you for this. The bank will seize your property. You'll have nothing." "I have something more valuable than property," Nathaniel replied. "I have truth. I have knowledge of forces your society pretends don't exist. I have the blessing of powers older than your nation, older than Christianity, older than the entire edifice of white supremacy you've built your lives upon." Emmanuel stepped forward then, his voice joining Nathaniel's. "What you're witnessing here terrifies you because it threatens the foundation of your world. If one master can see through the delusion of ownership, others might follow. If one white man can kneel before black gods and find truth instead of savagery, your entire racial hierarchy collapses. That's why you'll try to erase this moment from history. That's why you'll rewrite the records, change the deeds, suppress every trace of what happened at Bellwood. But you can't destroy what we've proven here. That knowledge survives. That power persists. And someday, perhaps long after we're all dead, someone will uncover this truth and understand what you tried so desperately to bury." The crowd erupted. Men surged forward, weapons raised, determined to stop this blasphemy, to silence Nathaniel and Emmanuel before their words could spread further contamination through the region's carefully maintained social order. But as they moved, the sky darkened impossibly fast. Clouds rolled in from nowhere, black and roiling, pregnant with electricity. Thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud that several men fell to their knees. And in the sudden wind that rose, people swore they heard voices, deep and resonant, speaking in languages that predated English by millennia. The approaching mob stopped. The wind intensified, tearing at clothes, extinguishing torches, driving dust into eyes and mouths. The Orishas had arrived to witness their servants' final sacrifice, to protect what they'd claimed, to demonstrate that white men's weapons meant nothing against forces they refused to acknowledge. In the chaos of wind and thunder, Nathaniel signed the emancipation documents. Emmanuel witnessed them, as did several of the newly freed slaves who'd gathered nearby. The legal formalities were completed even as the crowd scattered, seeking shelter from the unnatural storm that had erupted from a clear morning sky. When the wind finally died and the thunder faded, the crowd was gone. Only a handful of witnesses remained, and what they reported in the days that followed varied so wildly that no coherent narrative emerged. Some claimed they'd seen African spirits materializing from the storm clouds, dancing and laughing at white men's terror. Others swore Emmanuel had grown to impossible size, his scarified face glowing with divine light. Still others insisted they'd seen nothing supernatural at all, just a violent weather event coinciding with Crowder's mad declaration. But everyone agreed on one thing. After that morning, Bellwood Plantation was cursed. No one would work the land, no one would purchase the property. It stood empty and avoided, a monument to whatever had happened there, whatever transformation had occurred that white society had no language to describe or explain. The deaths began that same evening. Harrison Thorne, who'd led the delegation, collapsed at dinner, blood pouring from his nose and ears. A doctor who examined him found no medical explanation. His heart had simply stopped, as though something had reached inside his chest and squeezed. 3 more planters who'd been present at the morning's confrontation died within 48 hours, each death more inexplicable than the last. One drowned in an inch of water in his bathtub. Another burned to death, despite being found in a room with no fire, his body charred as though struck by lightning. The third went mad, screaming about demons with scarified faces, before throwing himself from the 2nd floor of his home. The pattern was undeniable. Anyone who'd witnessed Nathaniel's declaration, anyone who'd tried to stop the emancipations, anyone who'd spoken against what happened at Bellwood, died. And they died in ways that suggested divine punishment, supernatural retribution, forces beyond human comprehension, exacting payment for opposition to their will. By October, 17 people associated with the attempt to stop Nathaniel's transformation were dead. The local authorities, terrified and desperate, declared that Bellwood Plantation was under quarantine for unspecified contagion. No one was permitted to approach the property. The road leading to the estate was officially closed, and in an unprecedented move, the property records were altered. The name Bellwood was erased, replaced with a generic designation. Nathaniel Crowder's ownership was removed from all official documents, as though he'd never existed. The newspaper archives from that period contain no mention of any of these events. Not the deaths, not the emancipations, not the supernatural storm. The entire episode was suppressed with an efficiency that suggests coordination at the highest levels of Mississippi government. The story was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too threatening to the foundations of slave society to be allowed into public discourse. But in private letters, in diaries never meant for publication, the truth survived. A Charleston merchant wrote to his brother in Virginia, describing the impossible events at Bellwood, events that had left 17 men dead and an entire plantation abandoned. A doctor's journal contained detailed notes on the mysterious deaths, including his professional opinion that no natural cause could explain the pattern or manner of death. And Margaret Crowder's diary, discovered decades later by descendants, contained the most detailed account of all. She wrote of watching Nathaniel's transformation from a distance, of hearing the drums and chanting from the slave quarters, of smelling the herbs and offerings that pervaded the house. She wrote of her husband's growing obsession with Emmanuel, of conversations she'd overheard where the slave spoke as teacher and the master as devoted student. She wrote of her own horror at seeing Nathaniel kneel before forces she'd been raised to fear, at watching a white man of privilege and education surrender everything to knowledge carried by the enslaved. And she wrote of the final night at Bellwood, the night Nathaniel disappeared. It was October 23rd, approximately 5 weeks after the public declaration. The newly freed slaves had remained on the property, unwilling or unable to leave. They continued their ceremonies in the woods, continued their practices, but now openly, without fear of punishment or interference. Emmanuel led them, his authority absolute, his power demonstrated by the deaths of those who'd opposed him. Margaret had isolated herself in the west wing of the house, avoiding Nathaniel and the changes that had consumed Bellwood. But on that October night, she woke to sounds that drew her from her bedroom despite her fear. Drumming, yes, but also voices raised in what sounded like celebration or farewell. She moved to the window and saw torches in the woods, more light than she'd ever seen at the ceremonies before. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Nathaniel moving through the house toward the east wing, toward a room he'd had locked for weeks, a space he'd forbidden anyone from entering. Margaret followed at a distance, compelled by curiosity that overrode her terror. She watched as Nathaniel unlocked the east room and entered. Through the open door, she glimpsed an interior transformed beyond recognition. The walls were covered in symbols, painted in what looked like blood and ash. The floor had been marked with complex patterns, geometric designs that hurt her eyes to follow. And in the center of the room stood an altar, draped in cloth of red and white, covered with offerings, fruits, rum, honey, tools, and what Margaret was certain were human bones. Emmanuel stood beside the altar, waiting. When Nathaniel entered, the Babalawo smiled. "Are you ready?" the slave asked. "Ready to complete what you began? Ready to go where the Orishas are calling you?" "I'm ready," Nathaniel replied. "I've freed those I can free. I've spoken truth to those who refuse to hear it. I've sacrificed everything the Orishas demanded. What remains?" "You," Emmanuel said simply. "The final offering is always the self. You can't serve the Orishas partially, can't worship them while maintaining your old identity. You must surrender completely, cross fully into their realm, and never return. That's what Shango is asking of you. That's the price of the knowledge you've gained." Margaret gasped from the hallway, understanding flooding through her. They were talking about death. Emmanuel was asking Nathaniel to die, to offer his own life as final sacrifice to forces he'd spent months learning to worship. And impossibly terrifyingly, Nathaniel seemed willing. She burst into the room, all caution abandoned. "No," she screamed. "Nathaniel, whatever he's telling you, whatever you think you owe these gods, it's madness. You've gone too far. Come back to me. Come back to reason." Nathaniel turned to face her, and Margaret barely recognized the man she'd married. His eyes held a light that seemed to come from within, a certainty she'd never seen in him before. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've already died. The man you married ended the moment I drank from Emmanuel's cup in the clearing. What remains is simply ceremony. The Orishas are calling me to their realm, and I'm honored to answer. Don't mourn what's already gone." "This is murder," Margaret said, turning to Emmanuel. "You've manipulated him, twisted him, used your heathen practices to destroy his mind. I'll see you hanged for this." Emmanuel's expression held no malice, only the same certainty that radiated from Nathaniel. "You won't, because you understand, even if you refuse to admit it, that what happened here was necessary. Your society built itself on delusion. Someone had to prove that delusion false. Your husband chose to be that proof. His sacrifice will echo through time, will inspire others, will plant seeds that grow into liberation long after we're all forgotten." Margaret fled the room, unable to witness what came next. She locked herself in her bedroom and pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds, chanting in Yoruba, drums beating with increasing intensity. And then, at the moment of midnight, a sound like thunder that shook the entire house, accompanied by a flash of light so bright it penetrated through closed curtains and squeezed eyelids. When dawn came, Margaret forced herself to return to the east room. The door stood open. The interior was empty. The altar, the offerings, the symbols on the walls, all of it was gone. The room looked as it had before Nathaniel's transformation, as though nothing had ever happened there. But Nathaniel himself was nowhere to be found. His white robes lay folded neatly in the center of the floor, but the man who'd worn them had vanished completely. Emmanuel was gone too, and when Margaret investigated further, she discovered that all 63 of the freed slaves had disappeared overnight. The quarters stood empty. The fields were abandoned. Every person of African descent who'd lived at Bellwood had simply vanished, leaving no trace of where they'd gone or how they'd departed. Margaret had the east room locked immediately. She never entered it again, never allowed anyone else inside, never spoke of what she'd witnessed that final night. When questioned by authorities about Nathaniel's disappearance, she claimed he'd run off, perhaps gone mad, and wandered into the woods where he'd died of exposure or animal attack. The story was accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. Margaret lived in the house alone for another 14 years, slowly depleting the remaining wealth, watching the cotton fields return to wilderness. She remarried eventually to a merchant from New Orleans who knew nothing of Bellwood's history, but she never forgot what she'd witnessed, never stopped hearing the drums and chanting in her nightmares, never escaped the knowledge that her husband had found something more compelling than their marriage, than white society, than life itself. When Margaret died in 1852, her heirs attempted to sell the property. But the locked room presented a problem. The new deed specified that the east room was never to be opened, never to be examined, never to be disturbed. This unusual restriction drove down the property's value significantly. Several potential buyers walked away after hearing the stipulation, unwilling to purchase a house with a permanently sealed chamber. The property eventually sold to a farming family from Kentucky who needed land and couldn't afford to be superstitious. They respected the locked room requirement, though the children reported hearing strange sounds from within. Whispers in unknown languages. The shake of what might have been dried gourds filled with seeds, and once the unmistakable sound of drums. Though when the family checked, they found no drums in the house, no source for the rhythm that had echoed through the walls. In 1865, during the chaos following the Civil War, the house burned. The fire started in the east wing, in or near the locked room. It consumed the entire structure within hours, leaving only the foundation and the towering columns that had marked the entrance. The farming family rebuilt elsewhere, on a different part of the property, far from the original house site. The sealed room's contents, whatever Nathaniel and Emmanuel had created in that space, were destroyed by flames and lost to history, or so the official story claims. But there are other accounts, whispered stories preserved in the oral traditions of freed slaves and their descendants. Stories that say Emmanuel returned to Bellwood after the war, dug through the ruins of the East Room and recovered something. A box, perhaps, or a collection of objects. Things that had belonged to Nathaniel, or things that represented him. And that Emmanuel took these items north, to Boston or Philadelphia or some other city where freed slaves were establishing new lives, new communities, new traditions that blended African practices with American experiences. Some versions of the story say Emmanuel lived to an impossible age, that he was seen in 1890, 1895, even 1900, always looking exactly as he had in 1838. The scars on his face never fading, his eyes never losing that unsettling intensity. These stories claim he established a temple somewhere in the north, a place where Yoruba practices were taught openly, where the knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage was finally honored without persecution. Other versions say Emmanuel returned to Africa, carrying with him proof that the Orishas had been served even in the heart of American slavery, even by a white man who'd learned to worship forces his society denied. That he presented this proof to priests in Nigeria or Benin, who received it with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy that the knowledge had survived, sorrow for what that survival had cost. But the most persistent version of the story, the one that appears in multiple sources across different decades, claims something far stranger. That Nathaniel Crowder didn't die that October night in 1838. That he crossed into the realm of the Orishas while still alive, becoming something between human and spirit, between man and divine messenger. That he exists still in that in-between space, serving forces that transcend mortal time, bearing witness to a truth his society tried to bury but could never entirely destroy. This version appears in an 1870 account from a formerly enslaved woman in Louisiana who described meeting an old white man who spoke perfect Yoruba and carried the mark of Shango on his forehead. She claimed he told her his story, about being a plantation master who'd learned to worship those he'd enslaved, who'd sacrificed everything to serve African gods, who'd been taken by those gods into their service for eternity. She didn't believe him at first, thought he was mad or lying. But then he showed her things, she said. Performed divinations so accurate they revealed details about her family she'd never spoken of, called spirits who appeared as wind and thunder. Demonstrated knowledge that no white man should possess, that no mortal being should command. If you're watching this, then you've followed the Sealed Room's research into one of America's most thoroughly suppressed historical mysteries. A story that challenges everything we think we know about slavery, about power, about the limits of human knowledge and divine intervention. Whether you believe the supernatural elements or see them as metaphor, as cultural interpretation of psychological and social forces, the core truth remains undeniable. Something happened at Bellwood Plantation in 1838 something that terrified white society so deeply that every trace had to be erased, every record altered, every witness silenced. A plantation master did worship his slave, did undergo a transformation so complete that he sacrificed his wealth, his reputation, his very identity to serve knowledge carried by the people he'd claimed to own. And that transformation, that crossing of boundaries society insisted were absolute, proved so threatening that even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story remains suppressed in mainstream historical accounts. The lesson of Bellwood isn't just about slavery's brutality, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the fragility of systems built on delusion, about how certainty can become poison when it refuses to acknowledge competing truths, about how knowledge survives even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The enslaved maintained their practices, their beliefs, their connection to powers that predated their captivity. And when one man had the courage or madness to recognize that knowledge as valid, as real, as superior to his own inherited certainties, the result was transformation so complete that it had to be erased from history. Today, Yoruba-based traditions like Santeria, Candomblé, and Vodou thrive throughout the Americas. Millions practice these faiths, honoring the Orishas, maintaining the knowledge that survived slavery. Emmanuel's work, and the work of countless other African priests who were enslaved, succeeded. The knowledge wasn't destroyed, the practices weren't eliminated. The gods, if you believe in them, weren't forgotten. And somewhere, perhaps in the space between history and legend, between documented fact and suppressed truth, Nathaniel Crowder still exists, still serving, still bearing witness to what happened when a master learned to worship his slave, when comfortable lies met uncomfortable truth, and when the price of that meeting proved too terrible for American society to acknowledge. What do you think about this story? Does it challenge your understanding of slavery, of power, of what kinds of knowledge existed in the enslaved communities? Have you encountered other suppressed histories that reveal uncomfortable truths about America's past? Leave your comments below. We want to hear your thoughts, your reactions, your own research into these buried narratives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's interested in the parts of history that powerful institutions wanted erased. And make sure you're subscribed to the Sealed Room with notifications turned on, because we're committed to uncovering these forgotten truths, these suppressed accounts, these stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. Hit that like button if this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you question the comfortable narratives we've been taught about American history. Until next time, keep questioning. Keep searching, keep demanding truth, even when that truth is terrifying, especially when it's terrifying, because the stories that frighten us most are often the ones that